Welcome to Deep Transformation, Self-Society Spirit. I'm Roger Walsh, and our co-host is John Dupuy. And with us today is a person who's been a pioneer in the field of psychological development. In fact, she's a world leader in the field of psychological development. Her name is Beena Sharma, and she plays many roles. She is founder and president of the Vertical Development Academy. She's a consultant to individuals and companies around the world, also a coach to individuals and companies around the world. And she coaches not only how to develop skills, as most people do, but in addition to that, how to foster maturity, how to foster psychological development. I've taken practically every course Beena has offered in the last couple of years, so she's become not only a friend, but also a greatly esteemed teacher. And I have learned a lot from this remarkable woman. She's a very, very effective teacher and coach, and I and many others have benefited from her. And before actually turning to you, Beena, I want to just set a context, because I have actually said on this podcast on, I think, a couple of occasions, that to me, the most exciting discovery of psychology in the last 50 years has been that psychological maturation can continue past our 20s. We used to think that the mind more or less stopped developing about the time the body stopped developing. But now it's clear, crucially, limpidly clear, that we can mature far beyond what we thought of as the conventional levels of psychological maturity, far beyond what we thought of as normality. And that, to me, just opens extraordinary vistas and possibilities and points us to potentials that are latent within us all, and which may be essential for our very survival of our civilization. So we're dealing with an enormously important topic today. You've been a pioneer in this, and I've just had the pleasure of going through my notes that I took, very extensive notes I took in my courses with you. And I thought it might be fun to start at the big picture, because you opened one of your major courses with the statement that, with an invitation actually, to recognize that we are part of an evolving cosmos, and that we, in our dynamic being, our unfolding, are in some way a part and expression of an evolving cosmos, that we too are evolving and developing. So that's a big picture question. Please take it wherever you'd like.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank you. The way you've introduced me is high praise indeed. And I balk at the idea of considering myself a pioneer. I hold a fascination for human development for many, many years. And so I've just followed the breadcrumbs and have arrived at this fascinating field of the continuously evolving human as part of the evolving cosmos. I must say that the highest context I have gotten is from Sri Aurobindo, who is one of the sages of modern India, I would say. And so I think I would like to start there, just this idea that man is a transitional being. Nature has been evolving, has evolved man from an earlier consciousness, we might say, animal consciousness. And so what is it that makes us assume that we are the end of the ladder or the end of the evolution? So we are being evolved. And nature, so it's nature's secret is the evolutionary process. And the evolutionary stance is not a new stance, and it's also obvious. I mean, even at the very simple practical level, I know I'm not who I was 20 years ago. I have evolved, and I will continue to grow. And even when we imagine that there are some people who are not growing or who are stuck, we don't know the ways in which they are shifting. And we don't know the invisible forces that may reveal growth and development. So, yeah. So those are my
Uh,
initial sort of comments, if you will.
Wonderful. And you point to the fact that we're transitional beings and that there is so much more that the mystery of who we can become. And actually, I can't resist uh, uh, repeating a wonderful phrase I heard from someone once. They've finally discovered the missing link between apes and civilized humans. It's us.
I love that.
Yes. So your life work has been about exploring psychological development, and in particular, some of what we think of as the farther reaches of human possibilities, and this recognition that we can develop beyond, quotes, health and normality. Um, what does it actually mean for adults to mature? What's that imply?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great, just a great thing to meditate on, right? And a great question. So I want to go back to what you said. It's only in the last 50 years that we are acknowledging and recognizing that adults continue to grow after they have arrived as adults at age 21, when we are pronounced that we are now adults. And I want to say that that is from the point of view of Western psychological science. I would like to put it in that context because, in some ways, there are wisdom traditions of many cultures that point to what it means to evolve, what it means to grow, what it means to be mature. So, in the context of Western psychological science, in the context of measuring what maturity is, I would say that that's true. It's only in the last 50 years that we have something that we have identified certain structures of development that we have managed to glean through how language expresses reality, to how people make sense of their world. And we make sense of our world through language. And so when we look at language, we can begin to see what that reveals. When somebody expresses something or says something, we can see what it reveals about how they see the world. And so, based on research originally done by Jane Lovinger in the 60s, and then followed up with more extensive research done by Suzanne Cook-Greuter, who's been my mentor colleague, the farther reaches of development have been, in some ways, codified based on looking at how people describe their reality through this semi-projective assessment or instrument. It's like a verbal Rorschach. When you look at an image, you make sense of it. So similarly, when you have a sentence prompt, you fill in your understanding of that particular prompt. And when you express yourself, then you reveal the beliefs and assumptions that you hold and how you see reality. So I know it's a little abstract, but it's like, for example, if it would help, an example would be one of the prompts is raising a family. So someone might say raising a family is hard. That's it, nothing else. So there's nothing else that is being revealed about how they see that whole process and phenomenon. Another person might say raising a family is challenging and enjoyable. There's already more that person is revealing about what they see and how they hold it. And you might go further to and hear someone else say, well, raising a family involves paying attention to what is needed in the family system and partnering with your spouse. That is revealing an understanding of a whole system. And further on, someone might say raising a family means recognizing that I am being raised also. That is now revealing a capacity to see that it is an interdependent, interactive process, and the family is not outside me, something that I am doing something to, but it is also doing something to me. So this is just an example to share how we glean what is the level of perspective a person takes based on how they respond in language to this verbal Rorschach. So that's sort of the origin of looking at development, the capacity to take these levels of perspectives. And when Jane Lovinger did the original research, she saw these patterns. She saw that hundreds of people said exactly the same thing. So they had the same idea about who I am, who you are, what the world is, in exactly the same words. And then she saw that there were others, a whole set of other people who said something completely different. And then yet another set who said something completely different, but they all shared those worldviews. And so her brilliance was to actually begin to see how these worldviews are a pattern of evolving worldviews, where later worldviews, later ways of making sense of this beautiful life are more enlightened. They are not static, they're more dynamic. They are not outside, they also reveal the internal. They are not looking at one part of the system, they're looking at the whole system. They're not looking at one context, they're looking at multiple contexts. So you see this progression of capacities, and that gives us a fantastic roadmap for us to begin to see what this trajectory is like. This trajectory is being revealed through the stories that people tell. And so for me, that is such a gift. And when Lovinger originally did the research, it was forbidden to use that for anything other than research. She was very careful and cautious, and she had a theory that she developed. But the fact that we can actually use it today in ethical and supportive ways to help people get a sense of their own trajectory and what might be next for them is huge. If you look at the transformation industry, the coaching industry, where we have millions of people learning how to develop themselves and how to develop others. Not having this lens, not having the benefit of what this shows us is a big miss in my view. So that's what I've sort of spent 15 years in going a little bit deeper into what does it mean for the human being to evolve. And this is after having spent 10, 15 years on working in organizational systems, learning about large-scale change, but finding that I really need to look at the individual cell, the unit, the individual, because that is, I feel, the source and the root of all the events and all the sense making.
Yes, and so there's a lot in what you said, and just wanting to unpack some of the key things. As I heard you give a progression of responses to that single sentence, Tim, what struck me was that each progression revealed another facet of insight into the situation or into what a family is. Each was a richer understanding, a more complex, a more nuanced, and potentially more dynamic. So various dimensions of change you are pointing to there as what happens with development, it seemed.
Yeah. And go ahead, John.
Yeah, thanks. As Roger was saying, and you were saying, I think this recognition of developmental stages in humanity, it's one of the most possibly important things that we can grasp, because there are no problems on the planet right now that face us that don't come from, like your comment you made, Roger, about the evolved human beings and the rest of the anyway. And we have Putin right now, who's threatening to use nuclear weapons on other human beings if he feels threatened and doesn't get what he wants. I mean, really? So, and I looked at my country and I see the things that are going on, and I live in a part of town in a southern state. It's a very nice, safe neighborhood, but right across town, there's really poor and dangerous neighborhoods, and they never seem, it's just generational. They don't seem to be able to get out of, the violence and the drugs and all of these things. So what several questions is what do these higher stages look like? And one of the critiques of stage development is that people use it to get on an ego trip, like, oh, I'm a higher stage than you. You're such a, you're so blue, or something like that, if you're using the color system. And I think that probably reflects that the person who's saying it is not actually at the level they think they are, because I think and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that it would be a growth in empathy and compassion that would grow in the individuals as we move into these higher levels. That's a question. Is that so? Is that part of these stages of growth? And the other just pressing question, then how do we get there? Because it seems like, we're in one of these movies where the damsel is tied to the train tracks and the train is coming, and the royal Mountie, is he going to get there in time to save the woman on the tracks, which is us? So we're living in a time where we have the capacity to destroy ourselves completely, and the destruction that's going on the earth, whether it's the environments, the oceans, the air, is coming from us. So at a certain point, if enough of us get to a stage of development where compassion and wisdom increases, we might be able begin to roll that back. And the idea of using nuclear weapons on people because you don't get the country you want or something like that would go away. So what do these levels look like? Is compassion and understanding a part of this higher development? And how do we practically get there individually and work for our whole human family to make progress in this area?
John, you've given us enough for the rest of the dialogue. Beena, why don't you pick one of those?
Yeah, I'll just pick a couple, and I'll start with a clean language around how we use the framework. So for one thing, we don't say higher stages and lower stages. We say earlier and later. It's a process in time. It's a process over time, and the word yet is really important in this, in the process of supporting people to use the framework in service of development. So, she, he, they, I are not there yet. So we are, so just creating the space for this is all a process of development. And even the people who sort of misuse the framework and use it to get a sense of security that they know and that they are better, it's part of their learning curve. That's how we learn initially. We grab onto some of the, in a reductionist way, to some of the key elements to learn something, then we use it in a particular way, and then we realize that our assumptions are challenged, and then we realize, oh, that doesn't work that way. So for example, you might think that somebody at a later stage is this paragon of perfection, and you have the chance to see that they've been measured at a certain stage, so you know that they are at a later stage, and then you discover their feet of clay. You discover that, oh, it's not so simple. They actually didn't express their capacity, and they turned out to be just like anybody else. And then there's disappointment and cynicism. But that's the learning process that tells me that my frame and my model of reality doesn't fit what's actually happening. And that is the sort of driver of development, when I realize that what I imagine things are, they are not. And now I come up with a new way of understanding how things are. And we learn this every day. And in some ways, I would say that's one of the definitions of maturity is you come closer and closer to what is and not what you think it is. And that is in some ways also another way of saying subject becomes object. What you didn't realize that you were subject to the assumptions you were making, it now becomes object. You see, oh, that was my sort of filter, or that was my idea about what's going on. But that's actually not what's going on. The simple example I always like, because I've been married more than once, the simple example I like to bring up is, when you first get married, you get into a relationship, you have an idea about what that involves. and you're excited and enthusiastic about it. And then 5 years down the line, you realize after being challenged, after your assumptions being challenged, you realize, oh my God, I had no idea this is what it takes to be in a relationship, to be in a marriage, to be a spouse. And 10 years later, it hits you again. I had no idea that this is what it takes. So we come into newer and newer understandings of what is actually happening, what is real, based on reality challenging our assumptions about what is happening. So maybe I went into a different direction, John, but those were a couple of things I wanted to talk about. The assumptions we hold about the model, and then the process of development itself involves challenging our assumptions about how we construct meaning around whatever it is that we are engaging with.
And do you feel that being aware of this model, being aware that we mature into more adequate and more compassionate and perhaps more wiser ways as we get there, do you think the knowledge of the map itself helps people get there in a healthier, probably has maybe more efficient and hopefully quickly? We can save a few lifetimes of work if we realize that we're not the top of the food chain. And there's I think it was a Jewish mystic that once said, it's good to know what's above you. It's good to know that you're not at the end of the road. And knowing this, you think that's a help in itself.
Yes, and I know, Roger, you were going to say something. So would you, I can give a one
No,
sentence.
why don't you respond to John?
Sentence response. So based on my personal experience, I would say yes. Based on what I hear from the people who come into this work that are my colleagues, I would say yes. So based on that, I do believe it's a psychoactive model. And it's a very useful filter that helps me accelerate my development. And I have to be really cautious about using all the lessons that I'm learning about development to apply it so that I'm not making assumptions where they are unwarranted. So it helps me be more vigilant as well.
So beautiful. So what I hear you're responding to John's implication is that an understanding that first further development is possible, and secondly having some intimations of what those openings might be is, as to use your word, psychoactive, that has the self-catalytic potential for pulling us or opening us to those potentials. And that's a very beautiful thing. Gordon Allport, the great psychologist, said that by their own theories of human nature, psychologists either elevate or degrade that nature. Uplifting theories uplift human beings, degrading assumptions degrade them. And I think what you're offering is a very uplifting perspective on who we not only are, but who we can become.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think it has the potential. So I couldn't guarantee that it would happen every instance, but I think it's a beautiful thing to put into the mix, into the cauldron, into the mystery that makes everything happen. I think it's a very significant element to add. I would also like to highlight that there are ethical ways of using the framework, which I'd like to just a couple of things mention. One is it's only one way of looking at the human being. It's one of 10,000 frameworks in the sense of infinite. There are infinite ways in which we can look at the human being, this unknowable, mysterious happening. And this is one great way to look at it. So we have to be really clear that we don't use this framework to fix and to use it in a reductionist way. And that's one of the tragedies, I feel, of what can sometimes happen, that I have seen happen, that such a liberating framework can be used in a very reductionist way and actually cause harm
What does that look like when someone uses it in a negative way?
Yeah. So, for example, in a particular group, this was used. The assessment was used, and then people were labeled as being immature or at lower stages. It was used as a condition to include or exclude people into certain projects. Those are violent ways and harmful ways of using the framework. That's not the purpose of the framework. So that would be one, holding it lightly and to recognize that the framework is an abstraction. It's an idealization. The stages are idealizations. Nobody actually fully inhabits all aspects of a stage. But to begin to see how that universal abstract trajectory, how does that live in you? How does it show up in you, in your particularity, your life experiences, and not to reduce you to a stage? That's the most important piece. Even though we have an assessment and we believe in that assessment, we believe in the science, but we don't use it to fix the person. We use it as an entry point to begin to see what is this revealing about how you typically and automatically tend to hold certain views, anchor in certain ways. What does it tell you about you? Where is your foot nailed to the floor? Where are parts of you still ahead of you? So can you see yourself as this spectrum, and can this framework, some of the specific elements in this framework, help you to identify where you could make a shift? That's very, very useful in comparison to someone who is trying to support you, who doesn't have this developmental framework and is offering ways that you can develop yourself, but is not contextualizing it to capacity, to your level of capability and complexity thinking. So I think maybe 6 out of 10 times you'd still really be able to support the person, but maybe 4 out of 10 you'd miss the mark. You would end up, because of your own capacity or lack of capacity, you could end up being very much more concrete and linear and goal-oriented than your client who's actually flying higher.
Yeah, and this is very ancient advice.
And you could do the opposite. You could do the opposite, where your client is hungry for more inner work, inner perspective, and you're a coach that is set on setting goals and helping them take the next action. And so I've had so many examples, experiences, and stories from coaches who now realize how they've missed the mark with this additional understanding of this backdrop. So I like to use the framework as a reference point, as a doorway into really honoring and exploring the spectrum that human being is, and then to really honor their unique journey.
Yeah, and I'm aware we're getting into some of the implications of the work and dealing with some of the abstractions and issues that stem from thinking about this. But I'm thinking for people who don't necessarily have a background or understanding of your work and of the larger topic and picture of development, it might be helpful for us to go back a little and just try and give a feel for what actually for more of what happens during development. And I recall in one of the courses you did, you gave a beautiful set of metaphors for what happens with development. You've talked, for example, about the metaphor of growing from a seed into a tree. That was just one of many you gave. And I found that kind of, it felt like it gave different facets and perspectives, like, oh yeah, this is what's happening. Could you play with some of the metaphors?
Yeah, in that particular instance, we were actually elaborating on the multiple metaphors that could describe the ways of development, and that there's not just one. So, for example, we could say that the ladder is one metaphor, but the blooming is another metaphor. The flowing of water and carving new ground could be another metaphor. So that context was more expanding the idea of development. And I'd be happy to talk a little bit about the growth through these stages. I do want to address one thing that you had asked, John, about. So how do we get there? And so my short answer to that is we don't see vertical development as a goal. We see it as an outcome. Because by setting it as a goal and then trying to get there, there's no guarantee that we would actually get there. But it is an outcome of really investigating our assumptions, of looking at how we are making sense of life and working through the challenges that life is bringing to us, and all our challenges are our teachers. So what is happening today, all of the metacrisis, these are the teachers of humanity. That's going to challenge us to come up with ways of moving through them. So coming back then to Roger, your question. So what happens in development is you start with basically self-preservation and survival, because that's the first stage of development, or the fundamental stage is where basically you need to live, you need to exist, you need to survive. And as adults, when we have only that consciousness, then the world is a very threatening place. We see it's a jungle out there, and we need to protect ourselves. Everything is seen as an attack, and so it's fundamentally competing and making sure that it's either me or you, and I have to survive. So that's sort of the first level of consciousness. Oh, I don't like to use the word consciousness because it's too big a word to be used in this context. So it's the first stage, you would say. At the next level, there is what is. So, would you like me to share the names also, or that just? It's not.
Sure, you have some nice descriptors of these, and as I recall you describing the first stage as self-centric, which that says a lot to me. And your next,
you're centered around the self. Okay. So, we took 2 years to come up with names that were value neutral, that wouldn't prevent people from labeling others. So we're really describing the stage, not the person. We're describing a way of seeing the world. So at the next,
can I just say, I just love what you said. Each of these stages is a way of seeing the world and oneself. I mean, there's so much in that statement that helps me a lot.
Yeah, thank you. It's a constellation of beliefs and assumptions we have about the world and about ourselves and who we are, and what is important. What is the most important thing.
And maybe, as it sounds like you're going to give us the major stages, and perhaps it would be useful for people to have as a context that you've identified, you and your mentor, my mentor too, Suzanne Cook-Reuter, John's mentor too, Suzanne Cook-Reuter, as you've both identified 9 major stages that people go through, or adults go through. And I love Suzanne's metaphor. She uses 9 levels of increasing embrace, which I think is a wonderful metaphor. So that's the context for what I think you're gonna bring us into.
If you feel that would be helpful.
Oh, that'd be wonderful. Yeah, and with your key terms that really encapsulate them. Now I know you spent 2 years coming up with.
I'll try to keep this short. So yes, there are 9 levels, and we don't really operationally use the first level because that you're not yet, you can't yet function as an independent human being. It's the symbiotic level. So we start with level 2, which is the self-centric. The next level is the group-centric, where the first level, self-centric, is just, this is all about me and centered around the self. Now the next level is also the socialized stage, if you want to use Keegan's words. Now I realize that I can't just, it's not sustainable. It's not enough for me to all the time just be thinking about myself and grab what I need and not be included in society. So that when you see the limits of that first stage, then you step into the socialized stage where you begin to say, okay, I'm willing to play by the book. I'm willing to follow the rules. And so you want to fit in, you want to be included, you want to belong. There's safety in numbers. So it's not me versus you or them. Now it's us and them. So now you have a bigger boundary, but you can include others. And those others are those that could be my family, my tribe, my faith. It's conforming to a group identity. What's most interesting about this is that in our theory, which is based on ego development theory, so that's also something I'll need to mention sometime, is that there is no sense of self yet in the group-centric identity. There is no separate self. So if you attack my group, you attack me. So that's important to know that the psychology is completely identified with the group.
And often, though, one of the problems at that level is that if you begin to have a self-identity, you begin to grow beyond the accepted norms of that particular group that you're in, and the group itself will start to attack you.
Yes, that's definitely a dynamic, because the group wants to perpetuate itself. The group itself wants to replicate. And of course, again, reminding that nobody is only at one stage. So, for example, today, there might be aspects of the group-centric that operate in me in relation to some of my my key relationships. For example, I will edit myself when I'm interacting with my 36-year-old daughter. I want to make sure that she approves of me in some ways, and this is because of our history. But we do that all the time. I got married recently and discovered how much of an idea I had about what it means to be a good wife. And those are the norms that are established and that we follow at the group-centric stage. Of course, because I have later stage capacity, because I'm able to pass through that quickly, but I notice it. I notice it when it comes up. And I'm bringing this up so that we don't get caught up in saying that some people are there and I am not there. So there's more subtlety and more complexity in the way this framework, I think, is used and needs to be used. So from that group-centric stage, we then move to the next stage where we separate ourselves from the group. And this is considered the birth of the psychological self, where for the first time, I am not identified by the group. I separate myself, and my identity comes from what I do, not what the group expects me to do, not just what the group expects me to do. So what I do means it's not who I am, but what I do. So it's external, it's my craft, it's my role, it's my job. I'm identified by that. So what that means is if you criticize my work, you criticize me. There's no separation between what I do. My identity is defined by that. That stage is also called craft logic. And this is a significant stage because we all work in the world and we are paid for the work that we do. So we have a lot of our identity defined by that which we are paid for. So all the technology professions are vulnerable to this stage of development. So, the doctors, the lawyers, the technocrats, they tend to get stuck here because it's how they identify themselves, how they define themselves.
And very highly rewarded, I imagine.
And rewarded, yeah. And then there's also conformity at this stage, but then you conform not to your group, but you conform to the specialist group, to the professor in Harvard or the teacher that taught you. And it doesn't matter, it could be even a spiritual tradition, and you could be at this craft logic stage in connection with spirituality as well. So you can see this gets quickly even more complex. But it's a definable stage. That's interesting. It's definable. You can see the anchors. You can see the beliefs that keep people there. And
so just to summarize, so you started with the self-centric, where the center of the world is myself and my preservation.
Safety. It's, yeah, safety. Yeah.
And then you pointed to the possibility of expansion, where the center of gravity now becomes the group, my tribe. So and now you're pointing to a differentiation from that to an identity around my skill, what I can do, what I'm capable of. So I just wanted to point to the progression here. So it's beautiful. Yeah, please keep going.
Yeah, and we're always pursuing self-worth and self-value. So whatever gives us value, we want more of that. So the tendency is to get more to be more and more entrenched in that worldview, because your sense of self comes from there. So to break out of one worldview and to be able to step into the next is huge. It's a phenomenal achievement. And we recognize that at all the earlier stages as well. So when we have clients who are at these quote unquote earlier stages, it's a triumph and it's a celebration for them to begin to challenge one or two assumptions about conforming to their boss or not having a voice, even though they may have other capacities. But those kinds of shifts are what I think are really contributing to development in the workplace, I would say.
Beena, I just want to note again what you said there, because I noticed an inner response in me to hear you describe each new stage as a triumph, something to be celebrated. And it implies that there's this is a heroic quest.
It is. It is.
Beautiful.
It is, and it's beautiful. And I mean, this is, it's such learning for me, because when I came into adult development, and of course, we glorify the later stages and we pay more attention to later stages, and we think we have to get away from the earlier stages. So for me, one of the discoveries has been to love and appreciate people wherever they are. And initially, I would balk at the idea of coaching somebody who tested at this skill-centric stage. I would think, oh, they are so stuck, and how am I going to help them? And how, I would much rather work with somebody who's way ahead and who already has capacity and who's able to reflect. But I've found that over time, I just love working with individuals, even at earlier stages, and to recognize in some ways that the earlier the stage, the greater the gift. And in some ways, the later the stage, the greater the promise. Because at later stages, you have more capacity. You can do so much more. With just one session with you will get enough you'll be on your own for a year. You can work on all the assumptions, you can reflect, you can get feedback, you can begin to transform yourself. So there's so much more promise because you have so much more capacity. But earlier the stage, because they are so fundamental, those assumptions, the gift is greater. If you can break one or two of those stage-related anchors or footholds, as I call it, that's liberation that can just bring great dividends.
Beautiful.
Are there not negative aspects of each of these levels? And I use developmentalism in my work with drug addicts for years, and it weren't pretty. And the people that I was working with for many years are people in late stage addiction. And one of the things that I noticed using this kind of developmental perspective is that before they started taking drugs, they were at a certain level of development. They cared about their family, they cared about their dog, going to school, being a responsible something at some level. And then when the addiction grew, their developmental stage went down until the later stages. They're sociopathic. They're willing to do whatever they have to do to supply the drugs, that they're addicted to. And they will steal, they will rob, they will be violent, they'll sell their bodies, they'll sell other people's bodies. I mean, all of this stuff that would have been completely repugnant to them before, when the trance of addiction got that heavy, you found it there. And so when I was working with these people, I would hold up the mirror, and this is, they're off drugs at this point. They're going through the process of becoming more themselves or more human again. And they would begin to feel great shame and regret at some of the things they had done, and realizing that the person they used to be had gotten lost in this, and they were behaving in a way that was very primitive and very hurtful. So, and just as in children, early on, after you've gone through early childhood, you become very identified with your family, right? And that's who you are: your mom, your dad, your brothers and sisters. Then you move on to adolescenthood, which is lots of fun, as we all know, but it becomes very important. You find your group of your peers that you identify with, and it's really important that teenagers find peer groups that are healthy enough to help them stay within that level of development and prepare them for a more mature adults, going to college and this and that. And you find that some people never seem to get out of that adolescent. And I struggled when I was an adolescent. I had some were doing drugs, some were athletes, some were nerds and all this. And I was kind of a bit of all of that, and finding my identity there. And I've noticed that I've worked with a lot of teenagers over the years that whatever group you conform to is really, really important. And it is really hazardous and challenging. And it's a real issue. So it's not every group is good, let's say that. And you need to conform to a group that's good enough so that you can be there and move through that and mature into the version of yourself that you were born to be.
Yeah, so you started by saying, aren't some things negative in the earlier stages? So I don't see them as negative, I just see them as limitations. So here is where the other work that I do in polarities, which we won't go into detail here, it sort of comes into play. So it's not that they are so extremely self-focused that it's negative, that it's bad. They don't have the capacity to include the other. They don't have the capacity to embrace what is out, what is excluded. So it's a lack of capacity and not so much that it's negative. So that would be the way I would say it. And the second piece around some groups are bad, and it's really important which groups you are. That's only one part of it, I feel. And if you're talking about children and adolescents, then parenting is an important component of that. It's because we know people who've been parented so well that they navigate, they are more discerning because of the guidance that they have and other things in their environment. So sometimes, more and more I'm thinking, especially as I think about the metacrisis and the crisis in education, I think there's a crisis in parenting, which not many people are talking about. And if I take it further, I think there's a crisis in grandparenting, because the social fabric is breaking down. I'm a grandparent now, and I'm beginning to think, who do I want to be as a grandparent? And how do I support, how do I parent my adult child or adult children with my husband? We also have other children. How do we parent adult children? And then if I take it further, it's also a crisis in ancestoring. What kind of how do I become an ancestor? What does it mean for me? You may have heard this quote that I was so struck by it. Every time an old person dies, a library burns.
Wow.
I don't know who said it, but that has just stayed with me, And so how are we looking at parents, grandparents, and living ancestors? So we probably went off somewhere, but I wanted to say it's not just about the groups. It's also about the system, the context, the culture, the parenting. There's so many elements. Everything you open up is connected to everything else in a way. So.
Yeah. And and we've got a lot of different threads we could follow, but we're on a primary thread here of you showing the unfolding of development. So we've gone through the self-centric, the group-centric, the skill-centric. What's next?
Yeah, the next is truly becoming independent, not conforming even to those that are in my craft world, or who are in the kind of roles I play in the world, but truly having a sense of self-authorship. So it's self-authoring. We call it the self-determining, where I finally see myself as an independent, sovereign entity that I can think for myself and I can do what I want and I can come up with my own beliefs and I can change my beliefs. It's a huge leap from the previous stage, and I can be the master of my destiny, the captain of my ship. I can change the world. I can change myself. There's a lot of energy and a belief in predictability, making things happen, and an objectivity that is truly healing. Because for the first time, I can, like in the previous stage, I was saying skill-centric stage, you criticize me, you criticize my work, you criticize me, you criticize who I am as a worker or as a father, and you're criticizing me. You might be criticizing how I am as a father, but I take it personally. At this self-determining stage, for the first time, there is that separation, that objectivity. I can stand outside myself, and when you give me feedback or you are critical of me, I can actually look you in the eye and say, you know what, you're right. I could have done that differently, and I did not see that coming. Or there's a willingness to see that because there's that separation, and I become somebody that I can work on. Beautiful. Whereas in the previous stage, I'm working on everybody else.
Right. Well, so much easier to fix other people than oneself. And you implied a kind of capacity for self-reflection at this stage. And I recall that you've talked about the birthing of the kind of interior world, or the capacity for introspection and self-reflection. Is this coming online now? Or?
Yeah, it is. So the nature of what the reflection is about changes. So at the previous stage, at the skill-centric stage, they're not really capable of reflecting in terms of a self-awareness, but they're curious about themselves. So they like to see, what type am I? What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? In some ways, you could say that's reflection, but in other ways, it's not a capacity for deep reflection. It's still trying to define things and giving it quantitative measures. And at this stage, you really like to say, I'm an 8 in the Enneagram, or I'm an INTJ on the MBTI, and like to take, popular psychology tests and then share it on Facebook and say, I am this, what are you? So that's the first level of becoming, of even identifying who you are. And even that's a good step from the previous stage, So at the next self-determining stage, there's more reflection. There's more awareness of how that I can make mistakes, I can learn. And once I'm a little aware of that happening in me, then I can be kinder to other people. And I can also, forgive your mistakes, or I can say, no, we can learn. Let's learn, we can do this. We come up with models for measuring and learning from our mistakes. We can do plan, do, check, act. We can have learning cycles. So there's a lot more complexity and capacity. We're more interested now in process, not just in perfecting something, but in learning about how to perfect something and learning about how to learn, and then teaching others and teaching ourselves, and not just becoming a better professional, but I want to be a better husband also. I want to be a better parent or a better spouse. So that it's almost like a multiplied agentic, focus on changing and making things happen. But I am the agent. I am independent, I am separate. And if there are differences between you and me, my approach is, well, let's put it on the table and discuss it. And if we can come to an agreement, great. If not, let's agree to disagree. It's sort of objective, logical, and underneath that, there is a view that even though you have a different opinion, I can accept it, I can work with it, I can agree to disagree with you, but basically what I think is right, because I'm going to stick to my beliefs. I might of course be influenced, etc., but my sense of self comes from being clear about what I think is right and what I think is wrong. And I can, at this time, I could even, change my religion, because I choose my religion. I'm now into all kinds of isms. I will, follow other systems and choose. So choice is really important. Sovereign, independent choice is important.
And this, what do you call this? This particular.
This is the self-determining. I
Okay.
determine everything.
And is this stage 3? I'm trying to kind of track these things as we go.
This is 4.
Or okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually 5 because we are not including the very first. So we use 8 that are the operational sort of workable stages in our work. Yeah.
And to put this in a context, you also divide, you've got your 9, but actually for adults, 8 different levels of increasing embrace, to use that wonderful metaphor. Yes. And you've just taken us through the first 4. And as I recall, you also divide these 8 levels into bands, and saying this is effectively, we've been working with the pre-conventional and conventional bands of development, right?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, for bringing that up. So that first stage, that's self-centric, where you're only concerned about your survival and your world is very small, and you just don't have a larger context. You can't align with anything larger than yourself. That is called pre-conventional. So that's the band which is you're not yet socialized into society. You can be on the fringes of society, and of course, a lot of people can still be anchored at this stage and do very well in society because they have access to the next 2 or 3 stages. So remember, we had talked about nobody is at one stage only, but you have, of course, a lot of people who are primarily rooted in this stage. So the next 3 stages that we talked about are called the conventional stages. And at the end of that self-determining stage, we then move into what is called post-conventional. But here, I would like to bring in what I talked about, the ego development theory, which is at the heart of this framework.
And can I just, Beena, can I provide some context
yes,
here and
please.
say that one of the exciting things in this whole research field is that developmentalists have identified ways and different a variety of capacities that can mature, from emotions to motives to values to cognitive capacities to, in your case, ego development or meaning making. So you're focusing on one particular aspect of development, but a very central one, the very who and what we experience ourselves to be, and the way in which we make sense of our world. So this is your particular focus, as I understand it.
Yes, thank you. And it is Jane Lovinger's original construct of the ego, then that has been refined and further developed by Cezanne. So the ego is the core construct that underlies this theory. And so what do we mean by ego? Because, as I like to say, ego is a very big word, and there are so many associations from different disciplines, philosophy and theology and spirituality and divinity, and all kinds of fields have this, and of course, depth psychology as well, have used the word ego. And then we use it very loosely in popular use, in popular culture. So in this framework, the ego is that part of ourselves that's trying to make sense. of the world. It's that part of ourselves that's trying to come up with a story so that we can feel oriented. So it's also in evolutionary psychology, it's called the orientation reflex. It's just like you have a physiological reflex when, you go and the doctor taps your knee and your knee, has the reflex and things are going well. The psychological reflex is we have life experiences, and then we want to orient ourselves to what does this life experience mean. And if we can't make sense of it, that's disorienting. And so we are always orienting ourselves to making sense and making meaning. And that part of ourselves that is doing that process of digesting life experience, that is the ego process we're trying to understand. And then we tell a story. So the output of that is a representational story or a map. And that map evolves and changes. So this developmental process, we say, is the ego's evolution process. And what that does is it, in some ways, rehabilitates the ego as a vital and necessary part of human meaning making. So it's not
Can I just point to something here you've just said, Beena, because it gave a little light or flash of illumination for me. It's you implied that at each subsequent stage, the ego creates a more comprehensive, nuanced, meaningful, significant map to understand ourselves and the world.
Yes.
Beautiful. Yeah. Please go on.
And yes, so we've covered the conventional stages, and in our framework, we represent the development as an arc. So the arc goes up and then it comes down, and that represents something, and it represents the movement of the core concept of ego development. So when the arc is going up, the ego is constructing a meaning and constructing a sense of self. So just like at skill-centric, I'm this type, I'm that type, I like to do this, I don't like to do that. I'm defining who I am, and then that reaches a culmination in the self-determined human being where I know who I am, I know what I want to do, I know what I'm here for, I know what my goals are, I know how I want to change things. So that is sort of the highest point of independent sense of self. And life will then continuously challenge us, and the next evolution, the next step is the first post-conventional stage, where I begin to realize that who this independent person that I thought I was is a product of programming. Or I've been conditioned in this way. I thought this was my individual thinking, but I've been conditioned. I begin to realize that there's something deeper going on. So when you and I have a discussion, an argument, and we have different views, it's no longer can I say that let's agree to disagree. I now realize that my view is so because of my conditioning, my upbringing, my context, my programming, the way in which I was shaped and molded by my context. And that's why I believe what I do, even though I've chosen it. Whereas you have different beliefs, but you've been conditioned by your context, and that's why you believe what you do. So who am I to say that I am right and you are wrong? Now I realize that we are both right in our own way. So all perspectives have a truth within context. So for the first time, context becomes an important determinant of my understanding, which is a huge leap. And you're now closer to reality because that is true. Your context is different, and the context within which you came up with your ideas and beliefs is different, and it's true within that context. And now I realize that. So now it changes everything. It changes my whole world. Now I'm also rejecting what came before. All of that is suspect, because that world I've been there, done that. That's not the way things happen. Things are not linear. They're not predictable. Things are more dynamic. So there are a whole lot of other things come online at this stage. But primarily it is this opening up of the interiority, which is recognizing that even what I see outside is an interpretation. There is no actual thing out there. You know, you've seen those images where you have the visual paradox, you have the vase and you have the faces. So now all of reality is like that. There are both, you know, the vase and the face. It's both. It's not this or that. You don't just see one picture.
So what I'm taking away here, Beena, is that what comes online is a capacity for far greater multi-perspectivalism, capacity of looking at
Yes, absolutely. That's a good way of putting it. So now I'm interested in multiple perspectives because I'm recognizing that all of them contribute to what is actually true. So there are multiple facets of reality. There is no one reality out there. They are interpretations. It's the beginning of that realization. Whereas in the previous stage, at the self-determining stage, you really think that there is a one predictable thing out there that you can make happen.
And you call this stage?
This is called the self-questioning stage. So this is questioning how I got here. So now I'm curious. Now I want to go back and I may spend years here just discovering how I became who I've become and expanding my embrace to include the variability of other human beings. Diversity and inclusion. This is the gift of this stage in a deeper way, and greater tolerance for others, greater inclusion, greater understanding of ambiguity, and anything goes in some ways. You know, everybody is true, everybody is right. And so you can see that the limits of this, where there is nothing you can actually hold on to. It's like, you know, the rug has been pulled off under your feet and there's nothing to stand on, and you're sort of okay with whatever happens.
Sounds very disorienting.
Yeah, it sounds very
But
hard.
the discoveries, it's disorienting when you don't yet have what the next stage brings. And that's why we say that in some meta way of describing, every new stage solves the problems that are created by the previous stage. There are limits to the previous stage, and then the resolution comes when you step into a larger perspective, a larger embrace that integrates what's come before and creates space for new understanding.
Yeah, and a beautiful way I've heard of describing that is today's problems are yesterday's solutions.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So now, and in your understanding, it seems like this is really one of the crucial turning points or transformations in development, that one is going from an understanding of oneself and a reliance on what our culture has given us, to a kind of not just a birth of the separate self sense, as you said, but a birth of an individual outside the collective mythos in a way.
Yeah, and if you look at the three major sort of markers described by three different major theories, then that main milestone would be seen as different. So if you look at Robert Kegan's theory, for him the biggest shift is between the socialized and the self-authoring. And in a way, I agree with that, because 60 to 70% of humanity is not yet self-authoring, not yet come into that independent, objective way of looking at oneself and changing things around them in more productive ways. If you look at our framework, we emphasize this between self-determining and self-questioning as the big shift, because it's the beginning of the deconstruction of the ego. Until now, the ego is developing itself, building itself, defining itself, giving itself more names and definitions. And this is the beginning of questioning those definitions. How did those definitions even come about? So that's why this stage is seen as the biggest shift. But if you look at integral theory, this is still this, this is leads to the limits of the green, also called the mean green meme, also called the relativistic flatland view. And so from an integral point of view, that is the bigger milestone, is after this stage, where at this stage there's no grounding, everything is okay, everybody is right, everybody is fine, let's all convene and just continue to explore deeper explorations, but cannot take a stand, because that would mean saying that one thing is better than the other, one stand is more true than another stand, and that has already been challenged fundamentally, that the belief is now nothing is better than anything else, because who am I to say this?
That raises all sorts of problems, right? You can't make moral or ethical choices if everything is all the same, and something is not inferior or superior or loving or less loving, or however you want to put that. So that's a horrible problem.
Yes, and there is also an inability to see the performative contradiction, where the fundamental statement is non-hierarchy is better than hierarchy, which is an example of hierarchy, but that is not yet seen. And at the next stage, but it's such an expansion, such an exploration. And when I work with individuals at this stage, there's so much more scope to look at oneself, to continue to reflect, to begin to question the assumptions that they are making at the stage that they're at. So we're already in easy territory in terms of coaching people. I would say easier territory, because there is capacity. And so at the next stage, which is called the self-actualizing stage, so I'll just highlight, because I picked one thread, I'll just continue on that thread, that now if I say, well, who am I to say I'm right? It's all relative.
Right.
Now, at the next stage, you realize, yes, it's all relative. And there are some absolutes. You can't get away from it. You begin to realize that there are some absolutes. We need to take a stand, because it's unsustainable. The previous worldview has its limits. So now you begin to realize the natural hierarchy, and now there's another whole set of capacities that come online at this stage. Now you see the whole system, you see systemic view, you see the individual as part of a system, you see the system in context of other systems, and you really are interested in taking a stand and coming up with some higher principles that can solve the problems that are unsolvable at the earlier stage.
And what is this stage called, Beena?
This is called self-actualizing.
So would this be in integral terms or spiral dynamic terms? Are we talking about second tier at this point?
Yellow, yes.
Yellow. Mm-hmm. And does the capacity begin to emerge that you can speak to these different stages of development in the language that they can hear?
Yes, in some ways, even without knowing anything about stages, you naturally recognize you now really have an evolutionary perspective, because an evolutionary perspective somewhat has that hierarchical quality, that there is something that is continuing to grow and expand, whereas in the previous it's flat. So yes, and because you have that evolutionary perspective, you honor every part of that evolution. You can honor the earlier stages, you include them. A system is not viable without all of the pieces, and that everybody is in process. So there's a much greater understanding of the systemic, systems. There's true systems thinking comes online. And the one big distinction is that it's not just about systems out there, but it's also about internal systems. And that's what makes a true self-actualizing capacity. A lot of people can do good systems thinking. They can learn tools. They can attend systems thinking conferences. They can create balancing loops and reinforcing loops. But if they are not equally internally aware of their systems inside, their blind spots, their conditioning, then that's not true stage 5. So there's a misunderstanding of stage 5, because the interiority is also, the expansion of the interiority is not well understood in people who haven't studied deeply enough.
So it would be, sounds like what you're pointing to, Beena, is one's intellect can certainly outpace one's inner development, and certainly can outpace one's awareness of one's own inner universe and personal dynamics and blind spots and defenses, etc.
Yeah, and that's why just complexity of mind is not enough. It's complexity or capacity, but turned inward to begin to see all the various ways in which you can fool yourself, all the various ways in which you can hide from yourself. And then, so at this stage, there's a real interest in exploring what are things about me that I can't see. How, and so now at this stage, people like to do constellation work and, even do trauma work, recognizing that there's a whole lot inside that hasn't been explored. And there's a greater capacity to abstract feedback from the system without necessarily anybody giving feedback. So when I walk into a room, the way I operate in a context is feedback to me about what is happening here and how did I see the situation, how I'm with you, John, and how I'm different with Roger is feedback to me about what you are mirroring about me. That's the level of interest and awareness in one's interiority at this stage, and this huge capacity at this stage. And I would also like to caution that you may test at stage 5 and not have some of the complexity thinking skills required today to deal with the metacrisis and existential risk that is a new phenomenon. I mean, it's, the way the world is complexifying due to exponential tech is not something that we have had context before. It's new. And so we cannot assume that somebody who tests at stage 5 is going to be competent in thinking and cognitive skills required to address and mitigate existential risk or civilizational risk. And I'm pointing this because I feel that's my next interest and area of work, I think, over the next few years. I do believe thinking skills can be taught. I am a living example of this because I learned how to think and I taught how to think. In the first 8 years of my career, I taught lateral thinking, and I've been teaching polarity thinking for 21 years. So I know that it can be taught. So I'm really interested in this because that I feel is the need of the hour.
That's hugely important. And with the meta crisis, as you mentioned, and the internet, and how do you make decisions of what's right and wrong, and why not fall into this particular conspiracy theory, or how do you kind of sort it all out, and how do you base on evidence, and there's so much there. And if something appeals to you emotionally at a certain level, you're likely to run with it. And you can get in, you can join a gang, or you can, go the QAnon route, it's a very interesting phenomena that I've been affected by personally in my life. And how do you begin to sort these out? You're saying at level 5, you can't quite begin to kind of put the world back together again?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that actually at level 5, that some of the examples that you gave,
and this is the self-actualizing.
Yes.
Your term,
Yeah, some of the things that you were talking about, there would be a capacity to see oneself falling into those things. But it also depends on in what context have you grown into your level 5? Because there's so many dimensions of the self-actualizing stage. I was just pointing to a specific set of complexity thinking skills that are required today that I think need to be consciously developed. There's new terminology, there's new discourse around what's happening in terms of global issues that haven't been there before. And we all need to learn that. And so I feel I need to educate myself now. What is game B? What are generator functions? What are perverse incentives? I need to educate myself and learn how does this marry how does this marry with ego development and identity issues, and what is the relationship so that we can support people in both poles, developing them in both the interiority as well as the managing what's external, and fundamentally they are anyway connected.
Yeah, and this is obviously crucially important and something we'll want to get to, and yet I also want to make sure we complete the arc of development before diving into the multiple implications here. So you've taken us through the pre-conventional, three conventional, and now 2 post-conventional. So Beena, you've covered most of the spectrum of development here, and I believe we have 2 more stages to go. So perhaps you could point us to the next stage here.
Yeah. So we were at the self-actualizing stage, which is a very, very powerful, stage with tremendous capacity, and so we talked about, the central idea being that everything is relative and there are some absolutes. So there are higher principles, being able to anchor on higher principles, being able to work systemically, and also not necessarily having to listen to every voice in the system, which would be at the previous stage. So there is a natural sort of a hierarchical understanding and how that operates in systems. So if I'm working with 100-person organization in the previous stage, I would want to listen to everybody's story, and everybody needs to be involved. Mm-hmm. Whereas at this stage, I might actually be able to identify hubs or influencers and say, if I worked with these 10 people, then each of them could reach the next 10 people. So you can layer, and you have ways of integrating different perspectives. You are looking for other perspectives for integrating for a higher wisdom, not just to expand perspective. So
you can make judgments about maybe a lower perspective, a higher perspective, a more better, less better, that sort of thing. More harmful, more compassionate, less compassionate. You can start to
you can do, so we didn't talk about this, but maybe when we talk about polarities, we'll go through these stages again from looking at how each stage, what is their capacity to handle opposites and polarities. But I'll say one thing at this stage is, obviously you do both and thinking because you're more inclusive, which comes in the previous stage, begins to come online on the previous stage. But you can also do either or thinking at this stage. You can do both. You can do both and thinking and either or thinking. You can take a stand and you can do something short term. You can do, but always keeping the long term in mind. You can set boundaries. You can break boundaries. So all of those at this stage you are more capable of doing that.
And can you start integrating all the stuff from the previous stages in a more whole?
Yes, definitely.
Package.
Yes,
Awesome.
definitely. You integrate it externally, and you begin to see these within you as well. And you begin to see that there are parts of you that are at earlier stages. And of course, it varies. If you're familiar with the framework, then you see it more because now you give name to it. But if you had no idea about adult development and you had stage 5 capacity, I imagine that you would naturally be more compassionate to aspects of yourself that are sort of negative or that are dark, and you would be able to include more of other people's shortcomings and just be able to hold a larger context for that.
Yeah, I find that I in my life now, I've really found that I have deep conservative values, but I also have very progressive values at the same time. And so it's like I really don't fit into either club. We're so divided, this or that in our country, political, this party or that party. So it's been interesting.
It's
trying to figure out how to do that in a way that helps.
Yeah. So this, as I said, is a very powerful stage, full of capacity, and the I don't know if I could call it the shadow of the stage. One of the
Sure.
limits of the stage is it's all about mastery and knowing and being able to do and seeing so much in yourself, seeing so much in others, seeing so much in systems. And so there can be a hubris that comes out of that, and it's another shade of the earlier self-determining stage where everything is possible to understand. And so the mystery is not there's not enough space for fundamental mystery at this stage, though that's not the defining factor, but I just is one of the things to keep in mind.
Well, in my experience, I don't think it was hubris, but I was annoying. It's like as a born again integralist, oh, you see all this stuff and you want to tell everybody about it. Well, guess what? Not everybody wants to hear it. I learned that very quickly. So
yeah,
I had some professional issues. Okay, shut up. Yeah, they're not ready. But then I learned to adapt. Instead of talking, it was a very kind of born again green group that I was working in, and I was bringing all my ideas, and they were deeply offended by the hierarchical stuff. So I made it a circle, and I said expanding circles of compassion, and everybody, I was like, wow, this is great. But anyway, yeah, I that's what my wife told me. I was a born again integralist, and I could get pretty annoying. So hopefully, maybe I still am. I don't know, but here we are.
Yeah. So the next stage is another milestone. It's called post-autonomous also. So you have the pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional, and there's this another sort of milestone. And at this stage, so if we follow the same thread, I believe in these higher principles, I have convictions, I can take a stand. And now I realize that all of these higher principles, the absolutes, the stands that I'm taking, they're all constructs.
You mean mental constructions?
Yeah, they're construct. It's an idea. It's not necessarily true. It's not there. It's just a representation. It's trying to abstract and put a name to something that's there, but it's just an idea. And
maybe generalizations also. You might say that generally things. Anyway, that's just an idea. Instead of as well as an abstraction, that it's a generalization, the way that we put on things, and they can be very useful. I mean, mathematics could be.
They can be useful, yeah. The idea is here that you begin to see the functioning of the mind, and you see the capacity, the drive to fix reality and to name it as something, and then to see it's actually not real. That these are all ideas, and that if I change the idea or these are all filters. If I change the filter, the world changes. So this is a new order of recognition that there is no reality out there. It's what I am creating, which happens once. The first layer happens at the self-questioning stage when you feel that the rug has been pulled off under your feet, because how do I know what is true? It's all interpretation. It's all relative. This is another order of magnitude to there is no reality out there. It's the filters, it's the maps that I am creating that are trying to make things real. So now it's not like the rug is being pulled out from under my feet, but I like to say it's like the earth has been taken out from under me. So really there's nothing to stand on. It's the illusion of reality created by the mind is beginning to be seen through, and that can be very disorienting. It can lead to a lot of despair, because that same understanding is now taken to the self also. Now for the first time I see the self that I think I am is just an idea. What is it? Where am I? I can't locate myself. Am I the person I'm today, or the one I was 5 years ago or 10 years ago? And then I realized that they're all just images. They're just ideas I have, that this personality is a conglomeration of patterns. Those patterns are abstractions. So I'm really curious now about how the mind works, and recognize the mind as a mediating reality. And that the mind is coming in the way of direct grasp of experience, which can always only be now.
And Beena, can I just add in here, because it might help? I recall that you and Suzanne have used two names here, which I've found very helpful for this stage, which it sounds like they describe or encapsulate beautifully some of the qualities you're describing. One is that this is a construct-aware stage, where for the first time we become what we mistook for reality are actually only constructions or representations of reality.
Yes.
And also ego-aware, that we actually become aware of this, that Roger is just a mental construction. It's like, oh, yeah. So yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And some people at this stage, some people are more centered around the construct awareness, and some people are more centered around the ego awareness. You can see that also. So this is where it gets interesting, because this is an ego development framework. We started with saying that the ego is the one that's trying to make sense, and now you realize that the one that's trying to make sense is a construct. And so the ego begins to see its own illusion, the illusion of its own entity, if you will. And that's what the wisdom traditions are in some ways talking about. So is to begin to see that there is no such thing as the ego, even though, and so the meaning making is finally looking at the illusion of the meaning maker, if you will. And that's very interesting to me. And it's hard to grasp if you don't have some of that capacity. So I hesitate to talk too much about it, because I feel I'm only beginning to understand the various aspects and dimensions of it. But everything begins to get deconstructed then at this stage, and including the interiority. And then you have the next stage, which is the final stage called.
Can I before you
this is really interesting. Let's not run off too quick. Go ahead, Ryan.
Okay.
John, I have things I want to ask, but do you have things now? Okay, well, you mentioned the wisdom traditions, Beena, which you were referring to. I assume the great spiritual traditions, the contemplative traditions, the sapiential side of the world religions. There are three associations or three things that it feels like this stage possibly illuminates very powerfully. One is existentialism, which centers in large part on the recognition of so-called groundlessness. But what we've taken to be the ground on which we live our lives is actually just a construction. And the existentialists talk about the feeling of nausea, of disorientation, of being lost and having no ground, everything's unfamiliar. So that's one association. Does that resonate with this construct-aware stage for you?
It would. I would only say it's along with also deep orientation, because it's cumulative and developmental. So none of the previous things are lost in any way. So you're standing on top of that. So there's this additional layer of questioning everything. And yet I think there's enough understanding of complexity, of self, of one's own, that it's not completely an unmooring. I mean,
very good. Yes. So to thank you for that, because that makes clear that perhaps what the existentialists are pointing to is the initial entry into this stage.
And the questioning, yes, the questioning of everything that came before, yes.
Yes. So that's one. This stage for me created an aha experience of like, oh wow, these whole these traditions, this movement, etc., are probably grounded in people moving into this stage. The second one you already pointed to is the wisdom traditions, where there's across contemplative traditions, there's a recognition of the constructed nature of the ego. But the tradition which takes this deepest, I think, is Buddhism, which sees the emptiness or constructed nature not only of the ego, but of all phenomena. And that all phenomena are at bottom transconceptual. They cannot be encapsulated by any concept. And Buddhism sees this recognition as actually soteriological, capable of profound liberation. And I have to say, so, I've been trying to understand this for a lot of years, but I'm beginning to think, wow, this is really profound, because what you recognize is that we respond not to things themselves, but to our concepts. And once you recognize the constructed nature of our concepts, then that seems to undermine the automaticity of conditioned responsiveness and allow a liberating openness. Does that resonate for you?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that I could produce a Hindu text that says exactly the same thing.
Okay.
So I
Fair
wouldn't
enough.
say I wouldn't say that it's just Buddhism, but I think it's at core Hindu thought is pointing to that. It's not just about the ego, but it's about, just as you described it really beautifully. And the 2 or 3 teachers that I've been following, one of them is Nisargadatta, who really points to who's really has had the clearest the clearest pointing out in that way. And so I would say perhaps Vedantic, or
Yeah. And I think
have to be
you're
very
right.
careful about what I say, because I don't have my chronology in sequence, but I'm just learning. I'm just learning to situate even those are concepts, even that is a concept. The Hindu
Yeah.
way and the Buddhist way, that's what we do. We make them into concepts, but of course we use them to enter into the experience of what they are pointing to.
And how does one function at this stage? Because it seems like this great unraveling of, everything's a construct. So how do I put my pants on and how do I behave? How does this?
Oh, because you recognize, well, this is the either or mind working. We just assume if this is there, then the other things are not there. That's not true, because now you also, since you see through the functioning of the mind, you know that you're living in the world of mind and you operate in the world of mind. But the thing is, you now see it for what it is. And you don't reject it. You don't say, well, that's all mind, or that's all no mind. A more mature construct of it, as you step more and more into that capacity, it is more and more integrative, actually.
Yeah, and just to follow up on a previous thread, you're pointing now to that even within a stage there are substages. There's an initial entry, which may be disorienting. Then there's maybe a consolidation and integration, etc. Going back to the point about the implications of this, first off, thanks for your correction about, I had said this was most outstanding in Buddhism. And I think that's actually probably, well, first, thank you for pointing out that this recognition, of course, can occur in any tradition in advanced contemplative practice, and does. I would still say that it's more central to Buddhism. In fact, the so-called Madhyamaka philosophy, which centers on the recognition of what's called emptiness or construct awareness, is sometimes called, quotes, the central philosophy of Buddhism. So it's more than the Buddhists give a central primary emphasis to this.
I think it's more explicit or more obvious in Buddhism, because it's also tighter in some ways, whereas Hinduism is like a 1,000-armed goddess. There's so many branches and there are so many forms that it takes. But if you come to the more of the roots, I think this is definitely very much part of Hindu thought.
Yeah, very much. And the third school or movement that I wonder if you would comment on the possible relationship to is the whole postmodern phase of deconstructionism, which has had an enormous influence in intellectual thought over probably from the 70s for a few decades. I think it's fading a bit now, but would you comment on that?
I think it's alive and well in academia right now in the university. It's still
not in my medical school. No one's ever heard of it, John.
Because that's still conventional. Well, I don't fully, because that's not been my field of study, how postmodernism has shown up in literature, arts, and all the other humanities and fields. And I only have a sense, but I would say the root of that is the first post-conventional stage where you challenge orthodoxy and you challenge the system, and so the root of that is that realization. And then when it's applied to fields of thought and fields of endeavor, it takes all these forms and it becomes a thing in itself. It becomes a whole cultural way of looking. It becomes a whole science. It becomes a whole sort of manifestation of that. But the root of it, I think the root of things that you observe in culture and systems come from that meaning making within the individual. And then once it hits the culture, there are all kinds of complexities, that make it so difficult to sort of parse.
Yeah, I think the resolution, at least for me, might be, and it's a Buddhist teaching, but that emptiness is form and form is emptiness. First you realize all the form, and then it's like, oh my God, but form is God too, And so emptiness arises in form, and form contains emptiness, and it's like,
I will email you a Kabir Doha or a couplet from Kabir who just says exactly that.
Okay, well, there you go.
Beautiful. It's just a beautiful, awesome. And it's more about emptiness and fullness that he uses empty, and the empty becomes full and the full becomes empty.
Yeah. Okay. And the fullness is full of emptiness, and the emptiness is full of fullness, which is kind of cool. So yes. Anyway, this is fun. Let's keep rocking.
The yin yang, and I also want to show you this, which you just said. So this is my favorite conceptualization of this harmony of emptiness and fullness and all opposites, actually, the harmonizing of all opposites. So this is a form of consciousness, which is Shiva, a form of consciousness that is half feminine and half masculine. So you can see this side of the body is female. You can see the breast and the jewels, and this side is male. And this is personified yin yang, and this is the highest vision for being, not a human being, but being where all opposites are integrated, and it's personified in this. I just love this, so it's not an abstract symbol. This is the potential of our human form to be in harmony with all opposites, and both emptiness and form. So I just wanted to share that.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And now we're coming to the last stage. So please, Beena, we've gone through this trajectory, and please, on to the next.
Yeah, I think so. This is the ultimate complexity capacity at this stage, construct aware, and you also see that there's still. The self in some ways is still trying to make sense of everything, and you're still trying to map everything, even though you realize that they're all maps, but there is a tendency to continue to make more and more complex maps to grasp what is actually real, so that we can make sense of it. And at the next stage, which is the last stage, which is called transcendent stage, which is the unitive stage, you fall into no boundary, because now you're realizing that all of this is construct of the mind. Even the ego is just construct. And it's all, there's really nothing there. And then you actually fall into the reality. This is the way I like to explain it. You just fall into, so what? I mean, there's no limit to the mind, and there's no way we can actually grasp. And then what happens is then we really fall into the now, and the reality of this moment and this being and this form, seeing the limits of the mind, and recognizing that we are all one, that, like as I look into your eyes, I see it's the same reality manifesting in you or me. We are not different. Because the division is created by the mind, which I've sort of been able to see through. And along with a whole lot of cumulative capacities, now I can hold the entire thing. I can completely zoom out and completely zoom in, and see that even the zooming out and zooming in are divisions that I create with language. And so there is an immediate experience, unmediated by mind, a capacity for that immediate experience, which is again what the wisdom traditions are pointing us to. And so this no boundary consciousness, this capacity can hold all of it. So that's, again, it's an idealization, because people who have this capacity may still be integrating. They will definitely be integrating other aspects of self. Nobody is fully there. And what I love about this framework is that because it's an ego development framework, it bridges psychological development, pointing to the progressive expansion, progressive differentiation, progressive deconstruction, until we arrive at a no boundary consciousness through recognition of the limits of the mind. And so it bridges psychological development with what is called spiritual development. And I don't like that division of spiritual and psychological too, because it's a division created. This is all about human development. It's not psychological and spiritual. This is the potential of this precious life that we have, and the way we can make sense of it. So that's what gives meaning to me of this particular framework over other developmental frameworks that somehow feels to me like don't have a top. They're sort of topless. And I feel this connects to the largest context I can imagine, based on just my own experience, my teachers, and my ongoing exploration.
Yeah, and what you and Suzanne have done is you've given us what Ken Wilber calls a full spectrum perspective on human development and possibility, starting with infancy and the earlier stages of you even constructing and understand any representation of the world, all the way through to at least the early stages of contemplative, mystical union, unity, awareness, etc. So it's encompassing in a way that, as you said, very, very few other models of human development really are. And it's beautiful that it does bridge into the contemplative, some of the contemplative understandings and recognitions of millennia. So it's a beautiful, beautiful map to have, and to think that now we have this. It's not the final thing, of course. You and others will fill it out, and who knows what else you'll discover. But at least now, for the first time in human history, we have this. And it seems important, since you brought in the contemplative here, to point to a new possibility that Ken Wilber lays out so brilliantly in his book, The Religion of Tomorrow, which is not for the faint of heart. It's some 800 pages, but it is brilliant, as Ken's work usually is. And he points out that throughout history, the great gift of the contemplative traditions has been making available states of consciousness to us. And what you and other developmental psychologists are doing is for the first time in history, making available the stages of development through which the psyche can mature. And when we put those together, we have, for the first time in human history, a far fuller appreciation of what human capacities and potentials and maturation look like.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's exciting and it's nascent. It's a new field. We are just learning. So we have some research, we have the theory, but for me, what's most fascinating is how does this live in the human being that I am with?
Right.
And how am I alchemizing this concept? How am I alchemizing the framework through myself as instrument to be of service to the person that I'm with in this moment? And I think there's not enough being done in this area of, I loosely call it translation. But how do I bring this into service? That's what I'm most interested in. I love good theory, but I'm a practitioner at heart who relies on the best theory available. But the best theory is at best an entry point into the real experience. of what it means. And it's always unique and it's always new. So every person that comes into this work with us as we are doing teacher training or coach training is alchemizing this framework and learning new things about how does this show up in this person in this context. And so we learn a little bit more about that stage as a result of the practice. And in some ways, I feel our experiences are filling in some of the things that the instrument doesn't reveal. So I feel like through my own experience, through my own practice, as well as my own reflections, I'm learning new things that somehow belong to a stage because they hang around that fundamental worldview, which may not show up in the theory, but it's what life is teaching me. So in a way, I have to be cautious that I don't freeze that as if it's theory that has been proven, but as just lessons I'm learning and hypothesizing about and continuing to explore and experiment with as I work with myself and with other people.
Yeah, Beena, and also now that we kind of had this whole thing, would you say there's a growth of compassion also as we move to these more mature spaces?
Definitely, I would say generally speaking, yes. There is, of course, more compassion. There's more understanding. And that doesn't mean that there won't be contexts in which a person at a much later stage will fail to show compassion because they haven't had that opportunity to mature that part of themselves in a particular context or in a particular situation. So we are always working through our edges, and the psyche is infinite. I always say there's no way we can compute. There's no way we can compute anything, actually. And so I feel to carry the fundamental humility of unknowability and the confidence of influence. I think both of these, we have to hold.
And from my Native American teachers, you got the concept of let grow corn. In other words, a vision is only as good as it bringing it back to the people, bringing it back to the earth, and all our brothers and sisters, whether human or not. Will this help us to grow and be able to survive together and evolve into something more beautiful and something better for those that follow us? And if so, how do we take this knowledge and put it into our practices, our educational systems, our literature, our language, as just becoming more of a given, that we realize that where we're at, that there's a long way to go, but the journey is really fascinating. And at the higher altitudes, there I go with the high and the low again. Anyway, at the more mature levels, it's we can do more to fulfill our human destiny, if you will. And how do we do that practically?
Yeah, I want to say one more thing, and this is, I think, Sri Aurobindo's gift to me, is that we are very quick to appropriate the forces of nature as our own. So even this idea that we understand development and this is our knowledge and we can use this, we forget that all we are trying to do is name the evolutionary forces of nature that brought us here and that will carry us forward.
Beautiful.
Through my coaching, more and more, I'm pointing to the undercurrents of nature's secret evolutionary process that is at play. Can we just become more alive to these processes that play, not appropriate those forces, and learn from those forces, and then help ourselves and help others. So one of the ways in which we do that very specifically through the framework, since now you're familiar with, you are both already familiar, but since we've talked about the stages, we also look at what are called developmental movements. Like you mentioned, Roger, that within the stage, there is an early part, then there's a consolidation, and then there's the later part. So we see that at every stage, and we look at the developmental movements across the arc. So we have some people who are transitioning from one stage to the next. So how I coach them in the transition will be different from somebody who's just entering a stage and is consolidating. And so we differentiate that from somebody who is solidly at a stage but is falling back because there've been some life experiences that are challenging and they are falling back into earlier ways of being. We also look at somebody who's maybe consolidated, maybe transitioning, but is able to make that transformational leap because life is again showing them new ways, or they meet somebody in whose presence they feel more expanded. So they are in an uplift. So how to embody that and integrate that. So I find that also a beautiful way to begin to see how to support somebody by noticing where they are in terms of those developmental movements. So we've named a few other movements that are sort of recognizable. And I think I might close this part by saying that the ultimate really is to help the person be at home wherever they are. What does it mean to come home to oneself, to feel that you're optimally supported by your inner capacity to face the external environment or context?
Wonderful. And there's so much in what you've said, Beena, and I just want to name a few of the themes so that they stand out. One is you effectively pointed the idea that there are two very different skills here that are being called for. One is the more conceptual and creating the maps and understanding them, and that's fantastic. But then there's the deeper question of how do we use them skillfully to be more effective service, and that's your life's work, and that's very beautiful. You also pointed to the implication that yes, this is incredible understanding, but it's just a little flashlight in the infinite mystery. And it's a beautiful flashlight, and it illuminates so much, and yet the infinite mystery in which we live. And I actually wonder, I assume that appreciation of mystery comes online, perhaps at Construct Aware or somewhere. But you also then pointed to, is this alive? How is this alive, and how does it enliven each, a relationship in this moment? And I just want to say, one of the things I love about being and dialoguing with you is I just feel enlivened and opened and enriched. So you are transmitting, not only giving nice ideas, which is wonderful, and I'm an idea junkie, but you are transmitting wisdom from your lifelong work, imbibing these ideas and these ways of being. So yeah, thank you so much. It's very beautiful.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I have to say that even after studying ego development and, focusing on my own growth for 12, 13 years, having come into Byron Katie's work has been instrumental in supporting my accessing more of the construct aware. And depends on wherever your capacity is, it can take you. It sort of prepares you for that. So just questioning every single thought and questioning, is it true? And noticing how one reacts, believing that it is true, and then temporarily suspending, what if it, who would I be if I didn't believe that? And the experience of coming into that way of being without having the thought is an experiential falling into no mind. Yeah. So that's what has really supported me, and it has supported me in my relationships, because even with the capacities that I do have, I'm noticing how my judgments about other people come in my way. And when I use each judgment and question each judgment and then turn it around to myself, it's literally transformed the way I see life, I see people. So I would say that her work is a good training for construct aware.
Very, very good to know. Yes, Byron Katie. Yeah, I also am a great fan of Byron Katie's work and her beautiful questioning of all beliefs. So we now have a big picture overview, which is wonderful. You've given us the whole spectrum, the 9 stages of increasing embrace, the capacities that increase with each stage, the questions that emerge with each stage, the challenges. It seems like we're now in a position where we can begin to look at some of the big implications of this. And since you already brought up religion and the wisdom traditions, I would just like to put it. I'll put it as a statement to which I invite you and John to respond, and that is, I don't think it's possible to understand religion well without a developmental framework. As far as I can see, religion is one of our very, very few institutions which really has expressions at each and every one of these stages, and teachings for each and one of these stages, and a induction into and these stages, and more importantly, practices for moving people through them. So I'd love to hear your comment.
Yes. And if you'll excuse me, I want to go just before you asked this question, when you sort of summarized and said, you've talked about this whole model and, you summarized it nicely. I want to say one thing before we go to your question about religion. And that is, I think the key thing is for us always to be aware that this developmental model does this come in the way of me connecting with another person?
Beautiful.
And it can very easily do that, because we immediately have this thing that other people are not developed and we need to develop them, and these are the problems of the world. But the person in front of me, does this come in my way? Does it become it? The developmental model itself teaches us that the last stage, most mature stage in this framework, is one of no boundary consciousness, and we use the developmental model to create boundaries. And that, I feel, is not okay. So I just wanted to say that I have to be very conscientious about that not becoming a barrier between me and the human being in front of me. No matter.
And I would say that anything can be misused and abused. And just because that's so doesn't mean you shouldn't proceed with the work. I mean, we have a great capacity to muck up everything as human beings, no matter how lofty or beautiful the ideal or the ideas are. So, I mean, it's good to be forewarned, and I think we probably all experienced the misuse of developmental theory in our lives.
Yeah. For me, but this theory particularly, because this theory is teaching that the end goal is no boundaries, or including all inclusive. So this theory in particular, I think, would be most egregious, using this theory in that way. Yeah, I agree that all frames can come in the way. So coming back to the religion, it is. I do first. Let me say that I do believe that this framework can help us understand the dynamics of formal, organized religion and what happens with human beings in those organized systems. And I would also just broaden it and simply say that this framework has massive explanatory power. So you can use this framework to explain almost any field of endeavor and begin to see the evolution of any field of endeavor, because it's fundamentally rooted in the human beings that contribute to that field and what their models of reality are and what their models of the self is, what the models are. So, I mean, from micro to macro, you can use this framework.
That's a beautiful concept that has enormous explanatory power. And just to refine its explanatory power for religion,
yes,
as we were talking about, religions have specialized in cultivating states of consciousness. They have not known about, because we didn't have the requisite measures, stages of development. And so we have these conundrums of some people having very remarkable states of consciousness, but still remaining somewhat, it seems, immature psychologically. And perhaps most tragic example of that is given by the book, explicated in the book Zen at War, which describes in painful detail some of the Zen teachers around the time of the Second World War who were, I don't doubt some of them had quite remarkable states of consciousness and were extremely nationalistic, chauvinistic, sexist, and imperialistic, and supported Japan's World War II efforts. So it's a tricky business.
Yeah, it is. So I'm not sure how much I can. First, I haven't studied it that much. I mean, I haven't read that book that you're talking about, but I could say some general things from the way I've understood it. So one is that like the particular Zen masters you were talking about, there's the absolute and then there's the relative. The relative context is the culture. And then the absolute is just my relationship with God or existence or whatever it is. So in one dimension, I may have reached all these states of consciousness, but that doesn't assume that I have progressed through the various levels of maturity or more sophisticated ways of understanding culture in context. And I haven't questioned those assumptions because that hasn't been my attention. I haven't questioned my culture. I haven't questioned the norms. I just follow them because they're unexamined and I take them to be real. So there is a divide there. It is not an integral some development, one could say. So let me just pause there. I mean, I have a lot of other things to say, but I think I need some help in crystallizing based on your response and questions.
Yeah, well, one thing is that no matter where you have this Zen awakening, you will have it and interpret it through the level that you're currently at. And so, yeah, and which would explain if you're at this tribal level and you have this experience of oneness or what are the Zen masters are talking about, it doesn't kick you up to the highest level of human development. And that was really hard for us to understand. And I think in the integral movement, we began to look at that. And how do we get these teachers that seem to be able to transmit when they were around them, those of us around that we experience a oneness or something very powerful and mysterious that seemed very good, yet at the same time they behaved like they had barely any psychological or moral development in their personal relationships and how they used the power of their spiritual transmitting to treat the people around them. So tis an issue, but I think we can understand that spiritual development has to be accompanied along with moral, ethical, and psychological development too, or you run into myriad problems.
Yeah, I think at the root of it is also this division and between the spiritual and then the material. And Sri Aurobindo talks about that beautifully. I mean, he looks at 2,000 years of yoga and says the big, and I'm not talking about hatha yoga, but just the yogic endeavor. For 2,000
union with the mystery or with God, or however you want to say that.
Yeah, the yogic endeavor has been to reject the material and to renounce the world. And that's that's a big, what shall I say? It's a big divide or a mistake to completely reject the world. And that's the source of, or the core of integral yoga, is where you do both. It's not just about attaining God or about divinity or just about liberating the self. It's about integrating all of what is. And I think that's at the root of this is this either or division, and it shows up all the way up and all the way down. Even when you come up to the unitive stage, even when you come up to the spiritual traditions, there's one of the fundamental beliefs is that non-dual is the goal and duality is bad. And to recognize that you wouldn't have non-duality if you didn't have the concept of duality, that it's a polarity, that they both coexist and they're both interdependent, which is the gift of the construct-aware mind, is to recognize that that everything is a dance of the dual and the non-dual. You can't privilege one over the other. So there are many subtleties here which are all related, I think, to this concept of this either or thinking, which has many subtle manifestations or implications all the way up. So I don't know, Roger, if that was.
Yeah, beautiful. And John,
both sides of the street are God. It's like after that, it's yes. And
that's why you have. I'm just having this image. That's why you have a yogi in an Indian temple that has had experiences of union with the ultimate, and then comes out and kicks the temple dog.
Oh, nice. Hey, and I know Heidi is back. Why did you ask this question? So what do you, besides being, an academic and a philosopher and a psychologist, what is your personal practice? How do you keep yourself sane in this sometimes seemingly insane world? And how do you keep yourself on the path of maturation?
Yeah. That's a big question. First of all, I don't see myself as an academic. I don't even have a master's degree, I should say. I'm just deeply, deeply engaged in the process of living and understanding what that's all about. And it's difficult in these times, to keep my sense of, it's really a confounding time. And the more I learn from other people who are thinking about the metacrisis and about civilizational risk, the more inadequate I feel, and I'm compelled to find ways to get oriented and to be of service. In terms of practices, I think because of my lineage coming from India and the influences in my life, certainly reading the people that clarify my mind instead of generating more questions, I think I rely on them. So reading Nisargadatta and Sri Aurobindo and now Jean Klein, every time they just help me come to some sort of clarity about the fact that the ways in which I'm trying to get clear, or the way in which my mind is functioning, is taking me away from what is actually real in this moment. So I think that's my practice, is to keep coming home to what is here and now, and to see through the machinations of the mind and the ego, and then to just see it for what it is, and to live in this world more skillfully, and therefore to sharpen my mind to do that as well. And I have a living teacher I work with who has been an absolute gift for me. And I guess my life is my instrument, or this experience of being conscious. And so much is in transition, even for me, that I don't quite know what to say. Life is never not in transition, right? I mean, we're always in this process. So a lot is opening up for me. I'm realizing so much more I need to educate myself on and learn about, and then realizing that so much more of me, I just need to land here. So continuously bringing myself home, I think, is my practice.
And at the risk of categorizing you as within the terms of your own tradition, I think of you as an exquisite karma yogi, that is, or yogini, one who takes her life and her work as her practice, and also a jnana yogi, one who uses the intellect to discern all sorts of things, and including the relative and the absolute, but also the nuances of the work you're doing and the sharing and teaching you're doing. So I see you as refining both those paths in a beautiful way.
Well, and either is unsustainable by itself, right? And that's the central lesson. And that, I feel, is one of the most important things I've learned in my life, is to recognize these poles when they appear, and then to to learn to name them and integrate them. And sometimes, even without naming them, but you get a sense of what you might be leaving out, and life will tell you, people tell me, the world tells me what I'm excluding, and then to be alive and to be listening to that and then to include that.
And you've already mentioned briefly a couple of times, and John has mentioned one of the things that the world is calling us to, and that is to address the great crises we're facing. And we can think of both social and global crises here, but just thinking first of our society, all the pains and turmoils and turbulence we're going through in this nation and other nations around the world, and the very threats to democracy, and by way of context, it's long been recognized for centuries, even going back to Plato, that an educated and informed citizenry was essential if a society and culture was going to survive and thrive. And more recently, developmentalists like yourself and Susanne Cook-Greuter and Thomas Bjorkman, the Swedish philosopher, philanthropist, have pointed to the fact that we need not only informed citizenry, but a mature citizenry. Mm-hmm. And Thomas Bjorkman suggested we really need people at least at the self-determining stage, or a large percentage of the population at the self-determining stage, if democracy is going to survive. I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Well, that's a very difficult question. Yeah, I can't argue with that. That generally speaking, we absolutely need to mature civilization, mature human beings. I'm thinking of people who have studied systems and systems change. I think we need to be listening to people who understand large systems change at the global level. There's so many dynamics. There's the political aspect, the economical aspect, the technological aspect, how they all play together. And so there are a couple of things that I would say. One is that, where is the power? In whose hands is the power? And so the players who have power, what is their context and what is their capacity, and how, because they have much bigger influence on the rest. So that's one, the players that have power, and then the systems that have power, like, exponential tech, the kind of impact that is having. So it's unprecedented, obviously. So I think we are just all stumbling and learning and thinking, still trying to make sense of all of it. In terms of, I don't know if I could even call it solutions, but I think they can only come within context, within small groups where there's shared understanding and there's a capacity to collaborate. That's all I can say. That otherwise, the more we think about larger systems, then again, they become more and more abstract because they are far removed. And we imagine we have solutions for the rest of the system, but that's an abstraction. So I keep coming back to, I have to mature myself. And in the context that I play in, I ought to educate myself and influence as much as I can. So I think there are people out there changing the world for the better. I think there are people out there who can influence. And so I think it's important that the people who can influence and the people who are changing, that they have a better understanding of this developmental model.
And one of the implications you were pointing to with the need for our own contribution is, when we look at, well, what does our society need? What do people need to do about, the world? If we think about it deeply, it always comes back to the question, what can I do?
Yes.
There's only one person we can change most profoundly.
That's why I love Paul Hawken's work, even though it's within the context of climate change. His earlier work, not the work on regeneration, but his earlier work on drawdown, the research that they did, 100 researchers coming together from across the world. And then I was just stunned that the number one, what shall I say? I wouldn't, maybe the number one focus that would cause the greatest positive impact on climate change is the education of the girl child.
Mm-hmm. Well,
This was after, years and years of research and collating everything that everybody is doing around the world. But so that was interesting. So I feel we should listen. We should listen to some of the systems thinkers out there who've done the work and learn from those and begin to integrate those. And then his latest book is Regeneration. And I haven't read it fully, but I love what he has done and made it action oriented. So I can make my own little punch list of all the things that I can do. And it's the philosophy of regeneration. And I'll use Duane Elgin's words, which I love. He says that we become not like-minded. Like is also like. Not like-minded, but life-minded. What does it mean to be life-minded? That we support life. Life not just on the planet, but life as consciousness.
Yeah, two very important contributors. They mentioned Paul Hawkins and Duane Elgin, to be sure. So we're moving by natural extension to start to look at the state of our planet and the threats we're facing. And John, you have both mentioned the existential threats as the kind of metacrisis, the sum total of the crises. And just to set a context here, if we look at the extent of our technological power, which you've also pointed to, as Daniel Schmachtenberg calls it, our godlike technological power, which is accelerating exponentially, to the point where now our power is so great that if you look across the world, what you begin to recognize that what the state of the world now reflects the state of our individual and collective minds. Our powers are so powerful that we have molded the world, the planet, into the Anthropocene age, where the very physical nature of the world, not to mention society, culture, etc., is a reflection of our individual and collective psyches. And the implication of that is that what we take to be our global problems are actually global symptoms. They're symptoms of our individual and collective neuroses and immaturities and foibles. And that if we're going to effectively heal the great crises we're facing, we're going to have to do both outer work on the symptoms and inner work on the sources. So that expands what we need to do. And clearly, we are going to need, as the Aldous Huxley wrote the wonderful utopian novel Ireland, and when the stranger comes to this utopia, he's stunned and asks, well, where do you start? And they respond, we start everywhere at once. So clearly we're going to need to start everywhere at once. We know the blooming of 1,000 flowers. And one thing we're going to have to do, among many other things, is begin to grow our way out of these crises. Grow our ways out of the ways of thinking and understandings and immaturities that led us to create them. So this seemed here the explanatory power and the transformative power of developmental ideas such as your own just seems incredibly important. And I think one of the games we're playing with this podcast is John and I are really looking at what are the most strategic ideas we can get out into the culture, which would have most transformative power, most leverage. And clearly your developmental ideas are some of them. We somehow have to get the recognition of the potential for development and the ways we can foster it out into the culture at large as one contribution to this enormously, inconceivably complex challenges we're facing in our time.
Yeah, beautifully said, Roger. I totally agree that I mean, we have no choice but to develop our inner capacities, our capacities to explore ourselves and grow ourselves, and then our capacity to understand the complexity outside and to design solutions that are for the better, and be able to recognize the unconsciousness from which the current crisis has been created in some ways. So my work is in leadership, and early on, one of the things that I remember being struck by is that a lot of advances in human development or adult development in the work world, were being made as a result of a lot of investment by corporations in studying, and so that leadership could be developed. So in the context of corporate sort of understanding of leadership development, there's been a lot more impact in people in the world than coming from theories or from academia or from institutions, for example. So the amount of investment that comes into developing leaders is unmatched. I mean, I was shocked to discover, this was a month ago, that leadership development is a $161 billion annual industry. So why am I saying this? I'm saying that if we can bring in the developmental thinking and the complexity skills that are required for interior and exterior growth, if we can bring it into this huge industry there's a lot of money being spent and a lot of resources that are attempting to create the leaders of the future. If we don't bring in the thinking capacity needed to meet existential risk in the leadership development context, then we are failing, or rather we are missing a huge opportunity. So that's sort of where my attention is, because I have some access and connection to some organizations. So I feel like I'm a babe in the woods right now, even in understanding the complexity, the metacrisis. And I think that over the next 1 or 2 years, that's one of the areas of my focus, is how can I create leadership development modules that teaches leaders to understand what does it mean to define a generator function that's causing dysfunction in my system. At least let me start with my system. How do I recognize a perverse incentive in my organization? I'm trying to bring about change in my organization, but there are hidden perverse incentives that are not going to allow that change to happen. Can I develop my thinking to see that? And if I can see that, can I see that in the larger systems? And then can I see that in global issues? So I feel there's no choice for us but to train how we think and how we can learn from all the thinkers who are naming these things and defining what is needed. So at least that's one potential avenue, that there is almost unlimited possibility for us to influence decision making and design thinking. So how are we designing development of teachers, development of leaders, development of politicians? How are we designing their development? So everywhere it comes down to a design question. How are we designing policy? How are we designing governance? So it can quickly get, difficult to compute and imagine.
And you're pointing to the fact that all of this is the great issue of our time, this metacrisis, the sum total of both our inner and outer dysfunctions and very real possibility of civilizational collapse. And that needs to be the context of our thinking and our work as we go forward for if not all of us, then a significant majority of us.
Yeah, I feel I can no longer do coaching of leaders and say I'm doing ego development work or developing human maturity without including the capacity for us to look at civilizational risk.
Wonderful, and that feels like an exquisite example for so many professions and roles that whatever we do is now needs to be within this context of how does this serve our civilizational well-being and survival.
And therefore, for that to happen, I cannot, I have no voice or nothing to stand on to say that this is what we should be doing. I first need to educate myself. I need to understand. I need to learn how to bring those solutions. I recently was talking to a person who was in a program that I'm part of at a national level in another country. And this person has a $500 million budget, works in the telecom industry. So if I'm worth anything, if I'm coaching this person, I need to help this person think through the decisions that they are taking at that scale and where those decisions are impacting existential risk positively or negatively. I ought to be able to do that. Otherwise, I'm not being responsible.
And that clearly is your life calling. It sounds like you've taken this on as your life calling.
I mean, yeah, I feel it would be irresponsible for me not to.
Yeah, and my little bit is we need to work on ourselves and take self-development serious as a heart attack, which I've had. So it's pretty serious. And do that as a daily commitment to becoming the best versions of ourselves that we can be. And from that place, we can actually hold the metacrisis, because if I didn't have my heart and my feet in some deep, deep place, I would be completely overwhelmed by the pain and the suffering and the seeming stupidity of a lot of my brothers and sisters and how we treat each other and the things that we do in the world. So my commitment has to be to work on myself, and it requires a lot of work. And also to my calling is, okay, what can I do? And I realize that, I'm not the Messiah. I'm not going to be able to, go poof at all my visions of what we should be doing, but in each little way that I can and follow that, like, what can I do today, God, to fulfill, the reason I'm here. And I don't have that much time left. So what can I do to pitch in and do my bit? And then when we do our small part, as in chaos theory says, you never know. You never know if the butterfly flapping his wings over here is going to, create the Beatles in Liverpool or something. You never know what's going to happen. And that just commitment to do our best and to grow in compassion and wisdom and knowledge and keep our bodies and minds strong so that we can meet the challenges of our times is about as good as we can do. And then if there is a higher power, or if God has an agenda, and I certainly hope he does, or she does, then we can become instruments of that in a small way. And that keeps me from falling into despair, because I keep working myself and trying to open and do better.
I appreciate that. Thank you, John. I realized that I just named this yesterday, that one of the central polarity in my life that I'm working with now is I am doing and I am being done. That I am doing this and that I am being done. The things are happening through me. And if I just think back of all the things that I think I did, I took this decision. If I really ask myself, it actually just happened. And I attached myself to the fact that I did it, but it happened. And so there's something, it's opening up something in me of just trusting more of what is happening and what will happen. And of course, to attempt to do and to do as wisely as possible, but never to forget also that I am being done.
Yes.
Yes. And there's a beautiful line in an exquisite poem by the third Zen patriarch, which says, the non-dual is one with the trusting mind. And on the other side of that polarity, we probably ought to add the Islamic aphorism that trust Allah, but tie your camel. So both sides of that one. So we've had both of you have pointed to the importance of the question of what can I do, and beyond that, even what's the most strategic thing I can do. And you're both looking at that. And there's also the question of scale. How can these transformative ideas and the practices associated with them be scaled? And I can think of three examples that give possible implications. One is Neo-Confucianism, which beginning in around the turn of the millennium, about 1100 into the Common Era, instituted or created a whole collection of institutes throughout China and then throughout Korea, in which Neo-Confucians could really immerse themselves in Confucianism, not just as a philosophy, but as a living practice for cultivating people who were both wise but also politically involved. That was the sage was not seen in Confucianism as someone who retired into the mountains, but someone who was actively involved in politics in the world. Second example is what the Nordic countries what was called Bildung, and here we had Thomas Bjorkman, who was a wonderful guest who has been on our program, who wrote a beautiful book on Bildung, The Nordic Secret, talking about that the Nordic countries are in the late 19th century had deliberately instituted culture-wide training programs, or kind of like graduate schools where anyone could go to. You didn't have to be an academic or an intellectual, or you could be a farmer's child or daughter, but it was deliberately aimed at Bildung, that is the cultivation of the whole person. And Thomas Bjorkman lays out a very strong argument that this was really instrumental in changing the Nordic countries, which at that time were agrarian, into
very poor. Yeah, they're having all kinds of issues.
Yeah, into some of the most prosperous and livable countries in the world. So those two examples, and then today, something you've effectively pointed to, Beena, is Robert Keegan's idea of the deliberately developmental organization, that organizations can institute the idea of growth as an inherent opportunity and responsibility of every employee. So, and Ken Wilber and Dustin DePerna have extrapolated that in a quite brief but very important article, laying out the idea of a deliberately developmental civilization. Mm-hmm. And it seems like that's what we need now.
Oh, yes. Amen. Amen. Yes.
Yeah. So we're coming toward, there's been such a rich dialogue, so much, but as we come towards the close, do you see any ways in which we can make developmental programs more effective? For example, I think of two possibilities, and I'd love to have you add to them. One is we have an almost as yet untapped reservoir of wisdom and practices from the world's contemplative traditions, which are just beginning to be recognized in the West. But for example, I'm interested in the topic of wisdom. You look at the wisdom research literature in the West, it's like, well, maybe this is probably what wisdom looks like. Too bad we don't know how to cultivate it. And then you go to the wisdom traditions, of India, of China, of the East, and you find that they've got 50 practices for cultivating wisdom. So we have this untapped gold mine just waiting to be integrated with the best of our contemporary psychological understanding. So that's one thing. And then there's a question of both technology as the great opportunity and challenge. Are there ways in which technology can be harvested to foster development? Any thoughts?
Oh, yeah. The second one, absolutely. There's no question that technology can be harvested for good. And so again, it's a design issue, and it's also an issue of the people who are the players in the technology field, expanding their ability to see how this can be applied, and what are the checks and balances that need to be put in place while creating these godlike technologies that can truly support the evolution of consciousness, for sure. So the second, for me, the answer is absolutely yes. The first, what was the first one that you mentioned?
First one was a mining of the wisdom of the
practices,
great
yeah.
traditions.
So here I feel that, again, partly thanks to technology, but also thanks to the breaking down of all kinds of barriers and communication, all of these are available to anybody right now, which again is unprecedented. So again, that brings me back to the developmental framework, which explains why it feels like we need to make this more, make people access them or use it to develop people. So in the framework up to stage 3, 4, which is the stage, sorry, I introduced the numbers that weren't used before this, up until the skill-centric stage, there is no natural inclination to grow. There is, until the skill-centric, there's a beginning inclination to perfect one's task, to perfect one's job, because it helps the sense of self, because myself is identified by what I do. So the better doctor I am, the more degrees I have, the better person I am. That's the function of the ego at that level. It's only at the self-determining stage that there is that objectivity, willing to act upon myself and grow. So for anybody who is self-determining and above, we don't have, life is going to take them. Life is going to move them towards accessing all of these practices, just much as like you and me. How did we get here? We grew, and then we accessed, and we inquired, and we explored, and we learned, and we studied the wisdom traditions. So I don't have an answer to that first question, because research tells me that, up to 50-60% of the people are not looking to grow. That's where they are. If I use the framework to understand what is going on. So that is not really encouraging.
And yet I remember from your courses, you are very skillful at finding ways which will support these people to be more functional, more healthy.
Yes, and that's why I'm working with organizations, because the imperative for the skill-centric stage is the company wants you to develop. And so they wouldn't come on their own. We don't have self-selected people coming from that stage. There has to be some imperative. Why? Some imperative to grow. It's not a function of that stage. So then it has to be a function of the context, or it has to be a function of, unsustainable problems. When things start falling apart, then even people at earlier stages, would begin to say, oh, we have to do something. And then they would look. So I don't know. I know that's not an answer. And
well, it's a first step. It's where we are now. And part of the work will be to develop effective ways of supporting people, both to be more functional, as you say, where they are, and at least open possibilities for them for development.
Yeah, I guess I don't want to forget that, 50 to 70% of the population, generally speaking, is at conventional stages. So there are limits. Yeah. There are limits to the conventional mind. And when you have exponential tech that is expanding the reach of the conventional mind, then you can imagine. So people who are post-conventional need to use technology even more smartly to counter some of that, if you will. When the political climate changed in the US just around when Mr. Trump became president, we should not have been surprised, because it felt like people came out of the woodwork. It felt, because we assumed that there weren't people who felt so strongly about certain things. But research tells us that 50 to 70% are early conventional, and what we saw was the early conventional becoming more visible. That's it. I mean, that's one way of understanding.
Yeah, that's part of the picture. Yeah, we've covered an enormous amount here. It's been a tour de force, kind of like a great tour of human possibilities and maturation and stages and their implications and the possibilities that are available to us now that just weren't before. It's been truly just a wonderful voyage. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Beena?
Yeah, I probably would like to say that all frames are useful up to a point, for us to remember that all frames are constructs. Even the global issue, the collective we is an abstraction in some ways, and nothing is one thing, and everything is one thing, and nothing is a substitute for anything else, and every understanding is a misunderstanding.
Well, that's a good one. All right. I'm not sure I wanted to hear that, but yes.
Yeah, I mean, until we reach the next understanding.
I think.
Until we get to the next understanding that seems more comprehensive, seems more complete. And, everything is infinite. We know that. There is no end to anything.
And perhaps we're experiencing collective growth pains. Right, that times of stress and great suffering and changing an environment seems to be the thing, at least in the record that the Earth gives us. It's what brings forth change and transformation very rapidly.
And that's happening in our personal lives too. We are through growth pains, in every phase, and to recognize the war within, I think maybe that's where we could end. That the war outside begins with the war inside.
Yes, and in Islam, there is the lesser jihad, which is the battle outside, and the greater jihad, which is the work within. So beautifully said. Beena, I want to thank you so much. This really has been a gift both to John and me and to everyone that these ideas get out to. And your life's work is really an enormous contribution, and it really feels like a piece of the puzzle that's been missing, which just illuminates so much, has so much explanatory power, as you said, and opens opportunities for more effective living, both individually, collectively, and now as a civilization. Let's see, your work is available through, this has been a wonderful taste, but I know it's only a taste. Your Vertical Development Academy has a variety of courses for anyone who wants to dive deeper. And as someone who's dived very deeply into many of your courses, I can highly recommend them. They've just been a real gift to me and to so many others. And deep appreciation of you and your good work. Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah, Beena, it's good to connect with you more.
Thank you. It's totally my honor and privilege, and I feel I'm just learning. I'm just beginning in a way, and I am humbled. I feel in some ways, every piece is a missing piece, right? There are new pieces that we are learning more about, and I'm really looking to integrate from people who have studied more of the big issues that we're dealing with, so that I can include that in the work that I'm doing, and I feel it's our responsibility, all our responsibility. So, well, thank you so much for having me. I just loved our conversation, and I don't assume that I have it baked.
Well, I believe you actually teach that we're all in transitions. So thank you very much for sharing with us. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks, Roger. Bye for now. Until the next time.